Most people think Frank Lentini's story is a single image, a smiling showman with three legs. But the truth is a living mosaic. Stage lights in small towns, circus trains and winter kitchens, newspaper clippings and whispers traded between neighbors. Tonight, we're not retelling the postcard. We're opening the scrapbook. The pages are full of ink, fingerprints, and memory. And when we turn them carefully, you'll hear the voices that never made it into the headlines. Start with the man himself, not a myth, not a curiosity, a boy born in Rossellini, Sicily, who grew up to become one of the most recognizable performers in the American circus world. He was born with a parasitic twin, which left him with 3 legs and 4 feet, and he turned what could have been a life sentence of shame into a 40-year career built on skill, timing, humor, and a kind of relentless dignity. He called himself the three-legged football player, and one of his favorite bits on stage was to punt a ball with the extra leg, then improvise with the audience. You think you know the show, but behind that practiced routine were 1,000 small moments, some recorded, some remembered, some only rumored, that reveal a fuller human being. And we're going there. You can feel that humanity even in the way people talk about him decades later. A viewer once wrote to us, "From Middletown, Connecticut, my grandmother remembered him skating on the river with 3 skates. You can see it, can't you? The winter river glazed in late light, children pointing, breath clouding the air, and a man who refused to sit out a season just because balance would be harder for him than for anyone else." Another person told us a memory passed down through their family. His daughter was fine and lived next door to us with her husband and son in the 1940s. In fact, some of the circus performers found shelter at her home during the Circus, Hartford, Connecticut. I was 3 or 4 years old. My parents told me the story. Those are not museum labels. Those are kitchen table recollections, with the heaviness of winter coats by the door and neighbors who still waved. And it raises a question we'll return to. How did a global sideshow celebrity manage to stay so local? There's a reason audiences kept coming back year after year. Frank wasn't just a poster. He was a performer with craft. He'd talk with the crowd the way a good radio host does. Quick, funny, unafraid. When someone shouted something crass, he would sidestep without losing the room. One of his most quoted lines carried melancholy and mischief in equal measure. With a half smile, he'd say that even with 3 legs, he still didn't have a pair. It worked because it was self-aware, a preemptive strike against mockery. Laugh with me, not at me, and once you laugh, let me show you something you have never seen done on a stage. And yet, those public moments are only half the story. What about the private man who married, raised children, and, according to multiple reminiscences, was simply a good neighbor? People who claim they lived on the same streets remember him as courteous, quietly proud, someone who took the time to talk to kids and didn't carry the stage persona into the grocery line. If a canvas tent defines the summer, a porch defines the rest of the year. In those off-season months, the legends feel smaller and more believable. A father tinkering with a friend bringing over a pie, circus coworkers stopping by a house after a tough week on the road. In one winter story, a neighbor swears he watched Frank lace up skates and take to the ice like he belonged there. Awkward at first, then grinning when a muscle memory kicked in. Is it provable? Maybe not. Is it plausible for a man who insisted on mastering every physical task the world said he couldn't do? Absolutely. The show itself wasn't just spectacle. It was choreography of identity. He knew when to reveal, when to conceal. He wore a long coat in public to keep gawkers at bay, for control is a kind of privacy. People have written that he would answer even the most intrusive questions with grace, including questions about intimacy. Imagine how many times strangers asked him about private matters with no right to do so, and still he held the room. That doesn't happen by accident. That's a professional's poise. It's also a hint at how he survived emotionally in an era that sold difference as entertainment, by owning the frame. If you hold a magnifying glass to the route maps of the big shows, Barnum and Bailey, Ringling, you can trace his seasons like rings in a tree. Night trains across the Midwest, brutal heat under the big top, the sudden hush of a matinee when a rumor of a fire somewhere else runs through the tent. In the Northeast, people still connect him to Connecticut towns along river roads, places where circus people bunked in spare rooms, where the smell of hay and popcorn mixed with something metallic from the rails. That house next door story we quoted earlier about performers sheltering with his daughter's family during a circus stop in Hartford, it sounds right for the time. Old Hartford had a complicated relationship with the circus, full of excitement and, after tragedy, reverence. In those houses, the performers weren't ink on a playbill. They were guests who took off their shoes at the door. Let me pause on the question that always circles back. The sex life gossip. It's the rumor mill's favorite topic because it shocks twice. Once at the novelty of his anatomy, and once at the modesty of the era. Contemporary accounts say audience Q&A often veered that way, and he navigated it with humor and deflection. Behind the wink, the real answer is probably the ordinary one. He married, had children, formed relationships, and protected the people he loved from becoming part of the act. The most convincing stories describe a man who refused to let curiosity strip him or his family of dignity. The rumors? They age poorly when you set them next to the evidence of a household that functioned, loved, and kept boundaries. Back to the craft, people forget that Frank was physically skilled. He learned to run, ride a bicycle, skate, there's that word again, and even swim with an advantage he joked about, using the extra limb like a rudder. That image, cutting cleanly through water, not as a novelty but as a technique, is a good metaphor for his whole approach to life. When the current pushed the hardest, he didn't flail. He steered. That may be why the neighbors remember competence more than tragedy. To them, he wasn't a freak. He was the man who could do things. There's another part of this scrapbook I want to show you. The printed ephemera, pitch books, little autobiographical pamphlets sold after the show, paper you could tuck into a pocket and read on the trolley home. Fans kept them for decades. Some contained photographs staged for effect. Some contained a few pages of text set in uneven type. Every time one of those resurfaces, an argument breaks out online. Is this real? Is that detail exaggerated? Those arguments tell you two things: that memory is fragile and that people still care enough to fight for their version of a man most of them never met. The more fragile a memory, the louder we tend to defend it. Listen closely and you hear specific, repeated motifs in community stories. 1, he was kind. 2, he had impeccable timing, comic timing, social timing, survival timing. 3, he could be strict about boundaries when he needed to be. The house is for family. The tent is for the world. 4, he answered questions not to feed gossip, but to feed curiosity. And there's a difference. People left his shows feeling oddly reassured, as if his existence proved the world was wider than they thought, but also sturdier. Now for a small, complicated moment that lives half in print and half in rumor. They say that in certain towns, he would drive his own car between venues. Think about the practical difficulty of that in the early 20th century. Slippery pedals, clumsy gear shifts, the constant recalibration of a body at odds with standardized machines. If he did it, it wasn't to show off. It was to move through the world under his own power. Perhaps that's why the car story survives in fragments, because the point isn't whether it happened every season. The point is that people needed to believe it did. They needed their hero to be self-propelled. Performers of his era faced hostility and love in equal measure. The word freak was printed on banners with no apology. But backstage, many sideshow stars formed tight communities, and Frank appears again and again as someone respected by peers. In contemporary write-ups, he's sometimes called a king among them, not for dominance, but for steadiness. If you've ever worked on a traveling show, you know that the person who keeps calm during a storm becomes the center of gravity, whether they ask to be or not. That's a different kind of royalty. The family stories continue into the next generation. Some relatives' obituaries and local histories list the names that connect back to him. Daughters, sons, households that grew out of the glare of the Midway lights. Those are breadcrumbs on the public record, a reminder that life went on. That alone is a quiet rebuke to the gawking. You can't reduce a lineage to a headline. Let's return to the ice for a moment, because if you listen to the way people tell that skating anecdote, it functions like a parable. The child in the story, maybe a grandmother later, sees a famous man in an ordinary setting doing an extraordinary thing, and the world shifts. The circus tent is supposed to be where impossibilities live. Seeing one walk, then glide out of that tent and onto a public river rewires the brain. It says, maybe there is no inside and outside. Maybe the marvelous is just a person who refuses to ask permission. There are darker currents in the scrapbook, too. Any long career brushes against tragedy, small tent fires no one wrote down, winter illnesses that closed houses for weeks, the constant wear of answering invasive questions. Later in his life, relationships changed. Separations and new partnerships left their trace in the paper trail. But the tone of the memories stays oddly consistent. Even when people talk about sorrow, they talk about grace. Even when they mention the hard years, they circle back to the showman's smile, the one he used to control the first 30 seconds of a crowd's mood. That smile was part tactic, part philosophy. If you laughed with him early, you were less likely to dehumanize him later. It's a strategy as old as theater and as modern as social media. In an era when difference was a saleable commodity, he sold presence instead. Focused eye contact, comfortable pauses, a voice that never cracked even when the question did. There's something profoundly modern about that, a blueprint for anyone who's been made into a symbol against their will. Reclaim your frame, then keep talking. So what's left when we put the scrapbook down? A performer who mastered the geometry of an extra limb and the psychology of an audience. A neighbor who shared porches and winter suppers in river towns whose names fade in and out of census records. A father whose children and their children carry ordinary lives forward while strangers still argue about a poster. A man who swam straighter by turning his difference into a rudder, and who skated, if you believe the grandmothers, on rivers he had no business claiming, except for the fact that he showed up and did it. And a final thought. Memory is a chorus, not a solo. Some voices sing facts in key, others hum rumors off to the side. The song works because it's layered. Tonight we've tried to let you hear those layers. The verified headlines, the hands-past recollections, the whispers that reveal what people wished for him, competence, kindness, respect. You can keep debating the details if you want, but if you ask the people who say they met him or knew his neighbors, they will give you the simplest verdict of all. He lived, fully, stubbornly, skillfully, in the tent and on the ice. If this is your first time hearing his story, don't confuse wonder with pity. Keep the wonder. Retire the pity, and when you see a photograph of that third leg again, remember the rest of the body attached to it. The shoulders that carried winter coats, the hands that laced skates, the voice that turned a crowd. That's the picture that matters. You've just heard the deeper story of Frank Lentini, the three-legged wonder who lived far beyond the posters and the myths. A man who turned what others would have hidden into a lifetime of applause, survival, and whispered memories passed down through families. His story reminds us that the abnormal is never just a curiosity, it's a human life, layered with dignity, rumor, and legend. This is History of Abnormal. If you want more forgotten stories of those who defied the ordinary, subscribe and stay with us. Each tale opens another door into the strange corridors of human history, and next time, we'll walk through one that's even darker.